So you want to know about Project Lifecycles. This is the second video in our APM Project Fundamentals qualification, the PFQ guide. And in this we're going to be looking at the project life cycles. Just a reminder that while this is the content that helps you prepare for the PFQ exam, this is not a complete exam guide, but it should get you started, should help explain some of those slightly trickier parts and put it into context of the real world rather than just learning pure text to pass the exam. So first of all, let's talk about life cycles themselves. So within APM project management, we have three main types of life cycle: the linear, also known as the waterfall model, iterative, and hybrid. Now this has been a bit of an update since the previous version of APM. Iterative used to be known as Cyclic, and they have built some more content around that. That's why this video is a new upload, to bring this content up to date. So first of all, in a linear life cycle, we can see there are four main steps: a concept, definition, deployment, and transition. Within an iterative, we have a pre-project, we have a feasibility, foundations, assemble, review, deploy, and a deployment and post-project. Now you'll notice that I have kept the colors the same here just to try and represent the fact that we're doing very similar types of activity in these different life cycles, even if we're doing it in a slightly different way. So first of all, we're going to look at the linear life cycle in a little bit more detail, and this really is the most common life cycle you will use in the real world. So those phases: concept, definition, deployment, and transition. So first of all, concept. You'll notice at the top right hand side there is a remember sticker on here. These are things that you will need to know in preparation for the exam. That concept phase is all about the idea. What is it you want to do and why do you want to do it? In the previous video we talked about the importance of understanding what the benefits are of undertaking your project. So this is the what you want to do and why you want to do it. What are the benefits you're going to get out of it? Our definition phase is where we're doing all of that planning. We're defining how we are going to achieve that. How we're going to do it, what are we going to actually do, so the tasks, who is going to do them, and when are we going to do it. It's where we cover all of our scheduling, our budgeting, our risk management, quality planning, our scoping, etc. It's all going to come in there, and there will be individual videos on those areas to make sure that we cover all of that. Our deployment phase is where we deploy the troops. So our team are going to start actually doing all of the tasks. They're going to running those quality checks. We're going to be monitoring progress towards of our project against our schedules, against our budgets, against our quality plans, etc. So deployment is where everything happens. The transition phase, which used to be called the closure phase, the transition phase is where we move from being a project into it becoming business as usual, that BAU that we mentioned in the previous video. This is where the users that take over and start operating whatever it is that you've produced. This is where the change in the real world happens as a result of your project. So then we've got those four phases: what we want to do, how we're going to do it, let's get on and do it, and then let's hand it over and put it into action in the real world. So each of these different phases is going to produce a very specific piece of output, very specific piece of documentation. So again, there's a remember sticker in the top right. You do need to be aware of this. So our concept phase is going to be the main area where we produce a business case. We will look at a business case in more detail in another video. But this is the argument of what we want to do, why we want to do it. Should we proceed? Assuming we agree we do proceed, we're going to define how we're going to proceed by doing all of our planning, and we're going to produce that PMP, Project Management Plan. It contains all of those things I mentioned before about scheduling, quality planning, risk planning, budgets, etc. When we actually enter the deployment phase is where we are going to actually produce stuff. We're going to get our products are going to appear. Now remember, in the previous video I mentioned that sometimes APM like to use the word outputs in place of the word products. It's the same thing, they're interchangeable. So deployment, we're going to produce our products and our outputs. And in our transition phase is where we're going to start to see the actual change happen in the real world. So we're going to start to get our outcomes, and that change in the real world is going to produce our benefits. So each phase tightly linked to a very specific set of outputs. So it's quite important to understand that, and why we go through step by step through these different phases is because each of these requires some checks, and we're going to look at those on the next page. So reviews. There's a number of different types of reviews that we do, and again, this is something that you do need to remember and understand how these different reviews support us in delivering our project. Our very first type of review is called a gate review, and it happens between each of those phases. So after that concept phase, we have a gate review. After we've got that definition planning phase, we have a gate review. And the purpose of those gate reviews is to check that we're happy, we've completed everything we need to in the current phase before moving on. To give that another more detailed example, after the concept phase, we have produced a business case. The business case says this is what we want to do, here are the expected benefits, and here is the costs and associated disruption with actually going ahead and doing this project. So before we just plow on and start planning how we're going to deliver that and start doing things, we should stop, think, have a gate review that says, let's look at the benefits we get versus the cost and disruption of doing the project and make a informed decision whether we should proceed or not. And it might be, yes, we want to proceed, but in a different direction. So that gate review is really important. It stops us charging ahead when we shouldn't, saves money, saves time, makes sure we're considering all of the possible outcomes of what we're trying to do. We also have stage reviews. Stage reviews are more under control of the project manager, and they appear as often and whenever the project manager suggests they should. They are generally found within that deployment phase. So it's when we're actually doing stuff and we're going to put in some reviews, and it may be after these particular tasks are completed, we're going to have a quick stop and check that they have been done correctly and that we're up to date. If you're reporting into an external client, they may have a monthly meeting you want to do that they want to do, and you might decide to have a stage review just before that meeting because it's a good time for you to stop, bring together all your information about your progress, where you are, what you've done, what's worked well, where are you falling behind, so that you can go into that meeting fully prepared and up to date with exactly where your project is with regards to its risk, its quality, its budget, its cost, its scope, etc. So stage reviews, they're checks during that development or deployment phase. The next one we've got on here is the end of project review. Oddly enough, this comes during that transition phase at the end of the project. And what this is about doing some final checks that the thing we are handing over to the end user is fit for purpose, is what was asked for, and meets what we agreed to deliver as part of the business case. There's also an opportunity here for us to reflect on what we've done, what worked well, what didn't work well, what could we improve next time, and that learning process, it makes our projects better and it makes us a better project manager. It's really important that we do that and reflect on our activity. You may also have some milestones as part of your project, which are generally, not always, but are generally driven by key stakeholders, such as an external client or the customer, where they are asking specifically for updates at a particular time. They're often linked to payments. So if your client is saying, when you have finished this part, we are going to pay you for it once we're happy that that part's been completed. So those milestones often involve being a meeting, etc., where you're going to be able to say, this is what we've achieved, and they're going to say, we're happy with that, we'll pay the bill, or we're not happy with that, we're not going to pay the bill yet. So 4 main types of reviews. Gate reviews, really important, check before we move forward. Stage reviews, really important for the project manager to make sure that everything is on track where they think it should be. End of project review, last checks before we hand stuff over and see what we can learn from it. And milestones, normally driven externally by one of our stakeholders, by our customer or our client. So we can bring all of those things together into one diagram to help show how all of these things link together. So our very first part of our diagram is going to be our concept phase. We're followed by our definition phase, then our deployment phase, and finally our transition phase. Now you'll note that this is drawn slightly different from the original screen. We talked about this being the linear model, and I mentioned it's also known as a waterfall model. The reason it gets called a waterfall model is when we draw it like this and it sort of steps down. They're exactly the same. There is no difference between the two. If you draw it like this, people will call it a waterfall model or a step model. If you draw it as one straight line, as I had right at the beginning of the video, they'll call it a linear model. It makes no difference. So these 4 phases in a linear project are known as the project lifecycle. Now, remember that out of each of these phases, we have a very specific thing that comes out of it. Out of the concept phase comes a business case. Out of that definition phase, we get the project management plan. We've done all the planning. This is how we are going to deliver the business case. Out of that deployment phase, we're going to actually have our products or outputs. And out of that transition phase is where we get the actual change in the real world and the benefits that come from that. So it's really useful to see that 4 phases, 4 major outcomes from that. We can also pop onto this diagram our gate reviews. So we have a gate review after the concept phase to make sure we're happy before we proceed to definition. Once all of our planning's done, we're going to check, is our planning sound? Is it going to deliver what we said we wanted in the business case? If we're happy with that, we can move on and actually do all the things. But before we hand over our product at the end of the day, we are going to have another gate review to check that we're happy that we've done everything we said we were going to do and it is actually going to be fit for purpose. And so we can have our move on to our transition phase. And at the end of that transition phase, we are going to have that final end of project review where we're going to check everything did what we said it was going to do and learn from our experience. And during this deployment phase, we may well have our stage reviews. And again, there are as many or as few as the project manager feels is necessary. They can be once a week, they could be once a month, they could be seemingly random times as defined by the project manager. There's no strict rules around this at all. The more experience you get as a project manager, the better you get at putting in stage reviews. If in doubt, put in more than you need. You can always choose to skip one if you find that it's unnecessary. Better to have too many than too few. So let's have a look at this again. Here they all are, but you'll notice there is some space on the end here. We have something that's called the extended project lifecycle, which takes our 4 phases and turns it into 6. So the end of that transition phase, as a project manager, we are done. We've done everything, we've planned everything, we've done everything, and we've handed it over to the end user. So the project manager may well walk away at this point and move on to other duties. However, the project itself is still kind of going. We have an adoption phase. Depending on your project, this could be a day, it could be almost nothing, or it could be months. This is where the end users are getting used to the changes that have been implemented by the project. So it could be a phase where you're running two systems side by side to ensure that they are doing the jobs you need them to do. It may be there's a lot of training that's happening as part of this adoption phase. In reality, things like training I would do as part of the transition phase, and I would move that adoption phase to the left one column, even if it continued out into the column it's currently in as well. I wouldn't start it this late on. I would start it earlier if it included things like training. But we have one more phase to actually include here, which is the benefits realization. Because we have not actually developed anything and handed it over yet, we can't start getting our benefits until that transition has completed. We may start to see benefits immediately. We may find we don't see benefits for several days, weeks, or months down the line. And it could be that because we're still getting used to it, we're still in the adoption stage of it, we're still getting up to speed, we're still practicing, getting better at this new process or this new system, device, whatever it may be, it may take a while for our benefits to start flowing in. If you were if it was your project and you knew that the benefits were going to impact your business directly, you would definitely want to be keeping an eye on those benefits at the end of the project as part of the extended project cycle, life cycle, to ensure you were getting the benefits you expected. So this is a really important phase, even if the project manager often isn't involved in it. It's important that it happens and somebody is watching going, all of that money we spent and all that time we put in, are we getting the benefits in actually in reality, rather than, yes, I'm sure that will be fine. We need to measure that. So project life cycle and extended project life cycle for a linear project. In my experience, almost all projects you can run as part of a linear project, but there are definitely times when that is not suitable. And this brings us on to the iterative life cycle. So again, we've got the same colors because it is broken down basically into the same, very similar type of 4 parts, but it does get more complicated. So this pre-project is very similar to our concept phase. It's a high level of vision about what we want to achieve and why we want to achieve it, which is the same as the concept phase. We may not be able to write a similar kind of business case here because we may not have enough clarity about the way forward. And this is where iterative life cycles become useful. If you know what you want to do and you've got a pretty good idea how to achieve it, linear life cycle is for you. If you know what you want to achieve, but you really don't have a clue how to go about it, how's that going to happen? Nobody's ever done this before, or your business has never done this before, and there's going to have to be some sort of research and development, some creative processes. You're expecting to try things and they not work first time. An iterative process is going to be more useful. So our pre-project, very similar to our concept phase. Personally, I think they should have called it the same thing, but there we go. In our second phase, so this is our planning phase in a linear model, but if we don't know the way forward, we can't just go straight ahead and start planning. So what we might be doing is we might be looking at the feasibility of ways that we could proceed and investigating if they might be successful. So some research going on here, and part of that we'll get some foundations of, we do know what we definitely do want to do and what we don't want to do, things, ways that we do want to do it, ways we don't want to do it. And over time, by going over and over again and repeating that cycle, hopefully we will find a way forward and come to some kind of conclusion of how we want to approach this and can start doing some kind of planning. So these iterations are where the goals are clear, but we don't know how to get there. Moving on to our deployment phase. So remember, in a linear life cycle, this is where we just follow the plan. We start doing the things that the plan tells us to do. So in here, we might have only partial solution. So we might have a pretty good idea that we need 3 widgets, X, Y, and Z, but actually part of those, we don't know how they work together, or one of them doesn't exist, we can't buy it off the shelf, and we may have to develop it ourselves. So the yellow area is very much about the research, and the blue area is kind of the development phase. So we may try different things. We may build that engine, test it, find out that's not quite what we need, but we've learned from it. We can strip it down, make changes, rebuild it, and keep testing to aim towards our final goal. It is absolutely possible that during that development phase and this assembling, reviewing, trying it out, testing it, going back, making changes, it could very well be that we have to go back and change some of our planning again. So we go back and go, well, that's not the way forward. We've hit a dead end. We cannot move forward with that. We've got to come up with a new idea, back to the drawing board. Okay, so this is where we go back to another iteration between the planning of how we want to do it versus the can we actually make that reality. So we could potentially spend a lot of time between these two areas. It could be we have a iterative around our planning, but we're fine with deployment. It could be planning is fine, but we have a lot of testing to be done as part of our deployment, and that could be where we have a very cyclic model in there. Or it could be we come up with an idea, we try it, it doesn't work, back to the drawing board, new idea, try it, it doesn't work, back to the drawing board, and this more iterative kind of process here. The final phase of this deployment, we know that word because we've seen that before, and post-project essentially is the same as it is for a linear project. They've just kind of wrapped those two together. It's where we actually then go, we know what we're going to do, and we know how to do it. We've learned that as part of the iterative process. Now we're going to do it. We're going to transition that into the real world and go into those post-project reviews, benefits realization, and that adoption phase as part of that. Some people get really confused with iterative and they find it difficult to think about real world scenarios that's applicable to, because most of us don't encounter situations where we really do need an iterative life cycle. So let's use an example for you to think about. So we're going to think about the moonshot. So this is about the space race to put man on the moon. And our concept starts with, on the 25th of May 1961, JFK says to US Congress he wants them to commit to a goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. So essentially this is the project that is given to NASA. This is part of that first step in the iterative process of this is what we want to do. We're going to land a man on the moon and bring him home. And we've got a timeline of before the end of the decade. So this is said May 1961. Not needs to be done within 10 years. It needs to be done before the end of the decade. So that means before the 31st of December 1969 to be able to do this. And for those of you aware, the moon landing actually happened in 69. Although a little bit earlier in the year, so they were successful. But just think, if you were asked to do that with your current knowledge and understanding, where would you start? At the moment, you probably don't have much of a clue. You probably don't know how to build a rocket capable of that. You probably don't know how to build a lander that can land on the moon and get back. How do you build that spacesuit? How do you handle some of the human stuff, such as feeding and keeping people warm, the toileting requirements, all of these things? At this time, when JFK proposed this, NASA didn't have any idea how to achieve most of these goals. They could just about get somebody into orbit around Earth safely back to Earth again. But this was a major undertaking, and there starts an incredibly large research and development cycle of trying to work out, can we build a rocket that big? Can we actually get it to the moon and back? How do we take a person there? How do we land them on the moon and get them off the moon again? Lots and lots of questions they didn't have. So this is a really, really good example of somebody pitching an idea for a project, and they themselves have no idea how this can be achieved, but there's the goal. An iterative life cycle definitely is going to be useful. If we just pop back to this screen here, this feasibility and foundations, there's going to be lots of ideas, lots of scientists, lots of engineers talking about ways it could be achieved, lots of testing. If you're familiar with the Mercury program, it all starts with that and trying to build up the capability to be able to get people to stay in space long enough to make the journey, while developing the rocketry to be able to do it, while developing the landing equipment to be able to actually land on the moon and take off again, to be able to actually dock ships and undock ships in orbit of the moon and Earth. Really, really complex project. They were successful, we know about that, but what heck of a project for them to have to be given. So Moonshot's a really good example of that. You can picture that. It's a potentially a nightmare scenario for any project manager to be given something of that scale. It's like, I have no idea the way forward. But that's how an iterative project might come about. We know what we want to do. We have no idea how to achieve it. We're going to be doing lots of research and development. So from a PFQ point of view, that pretty much sums up everything we need to know about life cycles. Nearly everything you do will be within that linear life cycle, those 4 main sections. And if you think about things you do in your life, whether it's booking your own holidays or parties and things like that, you do step through those processes quite naturally in your head anyway. In project management, we're just putting a bit more thought and detail into that. So that brings us to the end of this section. Thank you for getting this far through the video. Our next video will be looking at the roles various different groups of people play within a project, and going into a bit more detail about the project manager's duties within there as well. Please leave a like on this video, and by all means leave a comment if you've got questions or anything you would like me to try and address for you. And thank you very much for your time. I hope this one has been useful to you.